Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting of 2025 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have no apologies this morning. Our first agenda item is to agree to take agenda items 5 to 8 in private. Agenda item 5 is consideration of the committee's approach to stage 1 of the children withdrawal from religious education and amendment of UNCRC compatibility duty Scotland Bill in private. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed, thank you. Agenda item 6 is consideration of a draft report on the Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill Legislative Consent Memorandum in private. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 7 is consideration of a draft letter to the Scottish Government on the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. In private, are we all agreed? That is agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 8, which is our final agenda item, is consideration of the committee's work programme in private. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. Thank you. Okay, agenda item 2. Our second agenda item this morning is to hold our final evidence sessions on the British Sign Language inquiry. In this inquiry, the committee is exploring whether the BSL Act, the current BSL plan and the listed authority plans are improving the lives of BSL users, and what changes could be made in the shorter and longer term to further improve things. I therefore refer members to papers 1 and 2 and welcome the first of 2 panels this morning. We are now joined by Professor Annalise Custers, Professor of Sociolinguistics, and Dr Robert Adam, Associate Professor in Languages and Intercultural Studies, both from Heriot-Watt University. Good morning. Joining us online are Stacey Gurley, Disability Liaison Officer, and Rachel Tarito, Equality, Diversity and Wellbeing Lead, both from NHS Forth Valley. Good morning. You're all very welcome to committee this morning. We have scheduled just under an hour and a half for the discussion. We have not scheduled any breaks, but please indicate to myself or the clerks if a break would be helpful. We will now move straight on to questions. And I'm going to start us off this morning and ask, what do you think are the positive impacts of the BSL Act? And also, what are the main challenges in meeting its aims? And if I can start with Robert, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting us to join you today. It's a real pleasure and honour. So the BSL Act has had an incredible impact on the Scottish deaf community. It has increased the profile of BSL, and this had led to increased access for deaf people in a range of areas, but there's still much work to be done. There are a number of local plans that have been agreed by various public authorities and organisations. There's been a lot of work involved and consultation in terms of understanding what BSL users' needs are. The key positives of a BSL plan is, I think what really needs to happen is consultation with deaf people to understand what their needs are. There also needs to be accountability, clear accountability, if change doesn't follow. And so there needs to be clear explanation of who is responsible for what in terms of delivery from the BSL plan. So while it's positive to see authorities put forward their ideas and suggestions about how they're going to promote BSL, what there needs to be is, what also needs to come is checks on how this will be implemented to ensure that this happens. So we have experience of organising Heriot-Watt University's BSL plan because we are a public body. So we organised a consultation process. So we consulted with the Heriot-Watt community, consulted with BSL users, consulted other stakeholders within the university to inform the development of our plan. We have a BSL plan that's presented in English and in BSL. What's disappointing is that not all public authorities have translated their BSL plan into BSL. So that limits access for deaf people in understanding the content of the BSL plan. It would be good to see more of accessibility considered in terms of local plans, but also more accountability. It is easy for public bodies to say this is something that we will aspire to do, but if they're not delivering on what they're promising, what are the ramifications? So if deaf people are not getting the BSL access that they were expecting, what are the consequences that follow? So we need clarity of otherwise it just becomes a lip service in terms of what's being offered to the BSL community. So what we would like to see is more robust standards and accountability in place.
Thank you so much. We'll now move on to Annalise, please.
So the BSL plan has, the various BSL plans have made BSL more visible across Scotland, both online and in the real world. So it's good to see BSL become more visible. So if you take, for example, BSL on screens, we're seeing more of that in various places. Moving forward, I think we need to understand, we need to give more attention to what is Scottish BSL, such as a corpus of Scottish BSL, filming how BSL is used in Scotland, because there will be regional variations. And so it's an opportunity here to collect a corpus of Scottish BSL. I think it would also be good to see more research in how BSL is used in Scotland and a better understanding of the Scottish BSL profile. Who are the people that use Scottish BSL? And I think this will be important in terms of feeding CPD opportunities for people who work with deaf people. We also need to look at how we can support teachers of BSL so they become more aware of how BSL is used in Scotland. And so there's lots of benefits that can be used to this Scottish BSL corpus data. At Heriot-Watt, we have at Heriot University and University of Edinburgh, we have 5 deaf academic staff. So this places us in a prime position to lead such research on BSL and Scottish BSL. And that can be used to inform how public services can be improved to address the needs of deaf people in Scotland.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask the same question to Stacey and Rachel from your context, from the public body and service. What do you feel has been the positive impacts of the BSL Act, but also the challenges in meeting those aims? And if I could come to Stacey first, please.
Thank you. I just want to sort of reiterate really what Professor Custis and Professor Adams have already said. I do believe the Act has made a clear difference. It's helped place BSL firmly on the agenda. It's given public responsibilities to actively promote and support the language, which I think is great. And having the national and local plans in place has definitely opened the door for more conversations and for more direct involvement with the community. And there's been some really positive local developments, especially where there's been sort of strong partnership working. That said, I still think progress has been relatively sort of mixed and uneven. Some services move quicker than others. And I think the day-to-day access for BSL users isn't necessarily consistent across sectors or geography. But overall, I think it's made a real clear difference.
Thank you. And Rachel, please.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, I'd echo what my colleagues have said as well. I think the key positives of the plan really is that it's brought it to the forefront. Certainly, speaking from a local perspective within NHS Forth Valley, it's really allowed our board to become really engaged with it and make clear strategic links to making this a priority, so that it's not just a tick box or standalone exercise. So within our joint BSL plan, what we've done is make strategic links with our equality and inclusion strategic framework and making it some of our equality outcomes, one of which is around accessibility, which we know continues to be one of the main barriers for our local users. So through continued co-production and engagement, we're really trying to focus on ways that we can make a tangible difference over the next 4 years with our plan. Like Dr. Adams had said, we don't want something that isn't measurable, and isn't it's just a tick box exercise. We want it that it is really robust and that we have clear measurements to show progress with this. And around that will be that continued engagement with the local community. I think also in terms of awareness, that is something that we really are trying to get across. And as Professor Custers shares, it's around that, making it local and making it realistic in terms of what our Scottish BSL users experience, and that's something we've tried to pick up locally as part of our plan delivery around our deaf awareness sessions, making sure that our staff and colleagues really do understand and appreciate the differences and nuances between regional as well. And I think that's been a real positive of the plan that we've seen.
Thank you. We've heard really positive feedback from BSL users on Contact Scotland BSL. But unfortunately, it's been threatened with shutting down a couple of times now. And we've heard feedback such as it's been life-changing for some people. What are your thoughts on this, on Contact Scotland BSL? And do you think there is anything that we can do to ensure that this is something that stays as a service for BSL users? To Robert, please. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, well, I was happy for Annalise to respond first. She was about to. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Contact Scotland BSL is an important service in the landscape in Scotland. Lots of deaf people use it, myself included. It is a very valuable service, and it has an impact on everyday life for people, just navigating life independently, being able to make phone calls and access services in that way. We also know that there are issues with it, however, with Contact Scotland BSL. So, for example, people are concerned about the behaviour and professional ethics of the interpreters who are servicing that contract, and concerns around confidentiality, that the interpreters have access to a lot of information through that service. And also some of the interpreters may not suit that type of work, because interpreters work in many different fields and may not necessarily suit that particular service. So I think the standards of service and perhaps the standards of the interpreters don't always align. So over the time, I think we do need a better evaluation of the service to see what deaf people actually think of it. Are they completely satisfied with it? Is there anything that can be improved? And that is important for ongoing monitoring and evaluation of such a crucial service.
Thank you. Would Robert like to come in?
I just want to back up what Annalise has already said, Professor Custis has said. It is a lifeline for deaf people, it really is. And it's an important service that we have. Being able to call and make contact with people through and in working hours and outside of working hours, which means it is life-changing, it is. Without that, we are reliant on, organisations and public bodies do not have a way for BSL users to contact them. And, it's important for both working hours and after hours to have that access. But it does need to be looked at. It does need to have a quality assurance and some evaluation. That is significant.
Thank you. Coming to Stacey, as someone who delivers that service, do you feel that there has been a change for BSL users using your service, and how do you feel that has improved service for BSL users, if it has?
Yeah. I do think that Contact Scotland is definitely, as been said, is a lifeline for BSL users. It gives people the freedom to call without sort of waiting for family, friends, etc. Especially when it's out of hours or they need a service quickly. I still think there needs to be a huge amount of sort of awareness on how to use it and the sort of the correct procedures around it. I still feel a lot of people don't really understand how it works, especially if we're trying to contact a deaf patient. So yeah, I think it needs a lot more work and a lot of awareness raising.
Thank you. Rachel, would you like to come in on this point?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I would echo Stacey's comments, and we know from our extensive engagement period with BSL users locally when we were creating our plan, Contact Scotland was definitely something that was, as Stacey and others have said, a lifeline, and it was something that we built in within our plan as well, so it would be a real loss, I think, to see that go. And it's certainly something that within our kind of risk assessment of our plan for going forward kind of remains quite high on that, in terms of we would need to look at alternative provisions and support to make sure that if it was potentially a loss down the line, wasn't experienced too greatly by our local community. So certainly is a concern for us and something that would be very supportive of continuing.
That's great. Thank you so much. We'll now move on to questions from Paul O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I think it's fair to say that there have been mixed views on the second national BSL plan. I think many users have said that they think it lacks focus, for example, or measurable goals, timelines, accountability, those sorts of issues. So I think it would be useful to maybe just start with your broad views, I suppose, on that second national BSL plan and how it assists with the development of local plans as well.
Who would you like to direct that to, Paul?
I'm happy to start.
Sorry.
Yes, I'm happy to start. Thank you. I think it's important to say, first of all, like I said earlier, that the consultation part is vital. If you haven't done that, then all of those local plans for deaf people will be meaningless. You have to co-design it. You have to have deaf people involved in the creation and implementation of those local plans. So, I personally would say it's not enough to just have a consultation in a room with deaf people, then go away and do the plan and then present it back and say it's a done deal. You need to actually have deaf people involved in it, leading the process, because these are people with lived experience of using BSL in everyday life. So co-designing it as a foundational principle for designing it and delivering it. And I think that's been an issue. It usually is run by people who do not have that strong background in deafness, and they don't have a lived experience of being deaf and using BSL. Yes, Annalise, I would agree that, as has already been said, accountability is vital. We need to know that it's measurable, that things like that. Many people will put together a plan, if you like, quite easily, but it's not necessarily deliverable, and accountability is unclear.
And I wonder if you can say what your own involvement was in the preparation of the national plan. So what influence did you feel that you had? And maybe just go in the same order of Dr. Adam and then Professor Custers.
Well, I did lead on the local plan for Heriot Watt University. So, yes, I brought that knowledge to bear there, so I understand how the local plans function. But I think the consultation for the national plans were quite limited. And Annalise has nothing to add to that.
And I wonder, we've heard evidence from various quarters that the national plan feels watered down, that it feels it perhaps didn't have the impetus that people desired in the consultation process. I mean, would that be a view that you would recognise?
I would agree, yes, I would echo that, yes, because, as was already said, accountability is lacking. We don't know what happens if what's been said will be done is not done. And I think that's really key. We need more accountability in this. And I think We also need better monitoring and measurement. Annalise. The second plan is much briefer compared to the first, so that is disappointing. And if I can add to that as well, with lots of language plans, there are language advisory panels to support and advise the government looking at how to actually implement and how to process the plans and how to work with that. But there doesn't seem to have been that in place. We don't have an actually representative board to advise the government on the progress and the work. So we're not seeing a cross-section of the Scottish deaf community represented in the process of creating or implementing this. So if you had that consultation body, that panel of expertise, then you would have a much more robust process for your national plans. I was just also going to say it's important to think about specific groups of people more targeted ways. So, for example, if you're looking at older people compared to very young children, the needs are very different, or teenagers, you know. So you might be saying, if you're looking at very young children, they are often not exposed to sign language except maybe in a mainstream setting, and they don't necessarily get quality BSL input. Older children or older people may have had learned sign language later, so there's a lot there to look at about providing opportunities to learn BSL at a younger age. We get Scottish deaf people coming to Heriot Watt to do our course, which is an applied language studies course in BSL, and we support them to develop their own identity, and we also have a PhD student looking at identities of young deaf people in Scotland. And so there's a lot of work to be done. We're finding there's a gap in the availability of BSL and access and the opportunity to develop your own identity as a deaf person in Scotland. Then, of course, we have migrant communities who are coming with other sign languages. So they don't know BSL, but they have other sign languages, and they come here and want to make their lives in Scotland. And, you know, they are often provided with a BSL interpreter, but they don't use BSL. So they need to learn BSL before they can really interact in their local communities. So we have some issues with all of that.
Just, if I can just go back to Dr. Adams' point on, I suppose, that expert group, if you like, that the government doesn't have in terms of BSL in the plan. I mean, there'll be a lot of comparison today with Gaelic, and there has been a lot of comparison. I mean, would your view be that the status that the board in Gaelic, for example, has as a national body for Gaelic should be replicated in terms of BSL in Scotland? I mean, is that sort of what you're pointing to there?
Yes, that's exactly it. Yes, it is that. I don't need to add really anything to that, although I'd like to add one other thing, that if you were to compare the BSL with Gaelic, then you need to look at teaching and education, because I know that we're not talking about that on today's agenda because it's been covered already, but it is a big gap when we're looking at BSL in Scotland. When you look at a language act, when you're looking at us wanting to encourage deaf people in Scotland, or anyone, to learn BSL, we have to look at education. So there are other elements to do with language planning that are also missing in the BSL Act.
I think we certainly heard some useful evidence from lived experience last week on that point, which was useful to hear that reinforced today in evidence. Sorry?
Rachel has indicated.
Oh, great. Rachel, sorry.
No, thank you, Chair. It was just on the back of Professor Custer's point, actually, around intersectionality. I think that was certainly something that locally we felt was really important through our engagement of the plan and also through our quality impact assessment. We knew that when we were developing, obviously using the national plan as a kind of framework for it, we couldn't just have one standalone action that would be a one-size-fits-all. So, for example, I think it was at the June 3rd committee, Avril Hepner had spoke about the need for a real focus on mental health in particular and the barriers to accessibility for our BSL community. And that's something within our local plan that we certainly experienced and was fed back from our community members. So that's something where that intersectionality for us really comes into play, and making sure that we do have robust measurements and different actions that are tailored to the different needs of the community. And that's where we've tried to make really strong strategic links to our, for example, our anti-racism plan, for asylum seekers, New Scots integration plan, and making sure that actually the BSL plan isn't standalone. It's embedded and integrated throughout all of this, so that we do represent the true needs of our local communities. And I think that's where potentially there was a slight lack in the national plan, like Professor Custers has shared and Dr. Adams, around the kind of measurement framework. So locally we've made adaptations for that to make sure that none of these actions get lost. But obviously any support we could receive for that nationally around the framework would always be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Rachel, I'll go back to yourself in terms of the engagement. Can you get into a bit more detail on what engagement you've had with the deaf community and the deaf-blind community in the development of your local plans?
Yes, of course, thank you. And I'll let Stacey obviously come in on this as well. She would have done a lot of the engagement herself, but I think we are locally in a very privileged position in the fact that we are, as a service, who kind of take the lead within NHS Forth Valley on the plan. We're based within the Falkirk Sensory Centre, so we do have a lot of kind of day-to-day interaction with our BSL and deaf community members, which is great. And we do also have a really strong position in terms of the fact that, although a small service, 75% of our team can use BSL. So again, it really allows with that kind of immediate interaction and ongoing interaction with our community. We produced a joint plan with Falkirk Council, so we shared the consultation process, and again that was based on feedback for service users not wanting that duplication of different local authorities and bodies going out and asking the same questions to then go away and produce a plan. So we tried a multitude of methods, obviously very mindful of digital exclusion and accessibility issues and barriers, and done that over the course of a good few months. But it is really around that continued engagement. We didn't want it, as Dr. Adams had said, to be a period prior to the plan where we go out and engage and then that's it. We go sit in a room, create it, and then nothing else is done. So it really is continued engagement for us that features very strongly. And we have constant contact with our local community to make sure that we've got that effective two-way feedback in place.
Thank you. Stacey, do you want to come in with anything else?
I think Rachel delivered that very eloquently. But yeah, I totally agree. It's not a one size fits all. So we've definitely tried to sort of tailor our plan, and we've had multiple sort of communications with the deaf community and the deaf-blind community, and that's an ongoing thing. As Rachel says, we're in a very privileged position that, you know, we are constantly in communications with our deaf community, and they raise complaints, they raise positive experience, and it's an ongoing lived experience sharing. So it's really good.
Thank you. I'll move on to Robert, if that's okay, and just in terms of, you know, if you want to share the engagement that you have had with the deaf-blind community and the deaf community within the development of your local plans.
As Heriot-Watt University has deaf staff and deaf students, we are able to recruit and consult the local community. And we were actually invited local deaf organisations to participate in the development of our plan. We were able to talk about our successes as well as issues that still remain. And we were able to get a number of ideas that informed our plan. So we were well positioned to do that, and I personally facilitated that consultation. And I think there is a real difference when it's a deaf-led consultation and deaf-led deaf leadership in the process. That makes a real difference in terms of developing the national plan.
Thank you. I'll move then on to my next question. Go back to yourself, Rachel. Obviously, you're talking about, you know, working alongside Falkirk Council. Are you kind of aware of any good practice in the development of local plans within, like other health boards, for instance? And has there been any opportunities to share and use that good practice within your plan as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, we're all very aware of the kind of resource shortage that we often experience within health and social care, and trying to make what we do have go as far as possible and make sure that we are allocating resources in a way that is responsive to the needs of our local community. So certainly we do constantly look for that shared learning and engagement with national colleagues so that we're not reinventing the wheel. We are taking good practice, but not just straight away embedding it, but actually engaging with our community members to say, you know, that this on paper seems like a really good idea. They've had a really good experience with it. Is this something that locally might be beneficial as well? So certainly within like the National Equalities Leads group and things like that, we have those conversations and put some of that shared learning into practice. I would say we have a really close and good working relationship with Falkirk Council colleagues, and so that kind of focus on sharing good practice between ourselves as well has been ongoing, and so very naturally informed the development of the plan. And we are looking as we go forward to obviously continue that wider integration approach with also Stirling and Clacks Council local authority partners as well, and widening it where possible. We also have really close working relationships, not just with other health boards, but with other key stakeholders. So, for example, we take a lot of learning from Police Scotland colleagues, where we could maybe do sharing of resources and approaches, or some partnership working as well.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really great to hear that. That's me. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. This committee has heard through the evidence sessions in the last couple of weeks real-life examples of deaf people, especially in rural areas, struggling. These examples, particularly in the private sessions, have been harrowing. Lucy Clark, who is a deaf survivor of domestic abuse, told the committee that there were only 3 BSL-trained domestic abuse advocates, all based in Dundee. How would a deaf woman who has been domestically abused in Argyll and Bute get the support she needs? Could I ask this question to Professor Annalise and Dr. Robert as well, please? Thank you.
Sorry, could you just clarify the question?
The question is around basically that there is not enough BSL support in rural areas, and we heard from a witness a couple of weeks ago in here who talked about the fact that they were a survivor of domestic abuse. So I'm asking the question that what should people like that do, especially if they stay in areas like Argyll and Bute and other rural areas? How would they get that service?
I think, like in other areas of deaf people's lives, they don't have a parity of service in terms of access and options. It's limited. It is difficult for deaf people to get good public services, not just in domestic abuse, but in other areas as well. I think the example that you give is very symbolic of the kind of everyday lived experiences of deaf people in rural areas. I think what needs to happen, crucially, is further training of those who are providing those services on how to work. But also we need more training on individuals to provide that specialist service, because 3 in Dundee is not enough. Heriot Watt University, we have carried out research in this area of domestic abuse. We have an understanding of what good practice is, but that has yet to be implemented. So that stage has yet to happen. Annalise. There is this assumption, this misplaced assumption, that those who live in rural areas can easily access public services via VRS, so the video remote services. But if it's a very delicate or a very sensitive situation, such as domestic abuse, receiving support via a video link isn't ideal. A different approach is needed.
Thank you. I've got another question. Another issue the committee has heard is that of poor mental health. Poor mental health is another barrier deaf people are faced with. Mental health services are already strained with regular budget cuts for people with full hearing, and these services are further stretched for those living in rural areas. Imagine how bad they are for deaf people in those areas. Similarly, when it comes to education, some pupils may have to move to different schools or different areas entirely, or even pay for private tuition. So can I ask, how might consistency in the BSL plans be improved across Scotland?
To do with mental health, again, it's down to training of people who can work with deaf people. We do need to see more deaf people become experts in domestic abuse as well as mental health services. We do need to see more deaf social workers, deaf counsellors, deaf therapists. One of the aims of the BSL National Plan was capacity building of deaf people with skills who can work with deaf people in the community. So to respond to both your points around domestic abuse and mental health services, we need more capacity building where there are deaf people who are trained as experts to support other deaf people in these particular situations. I understand and I do appreciate there are budget limitations, there's only finite resources that we can work with, but I do believe that training, support of deaf people to become specialists in these areas is a necessary way forward. Annalise, I would just want to re-emphasise that there's this assumption that if we just train more interpreters, that will resolve all of our issues. That's not the case. What we need to see is more deaf people with BSL receiving this specialist training, such as mental health. Because if you think about if you're experiencing mental health issues, being able to communicate directly with someone, an expert who can read your body language, who understands directly what it is that you're saying and how that's being expressed, that's going to be the kind of service that you need to support you through your difficult times. So I would say, and just so it's capacity building, as Robert Adams said. Robert, you mentioned a point about education. I think that links back to a point that I said before in terms of language planning, so language acquisition planning. So what plans are being put in place to make sure that deaf children are given access to BSL so that they can learn BSL? I'm not saying let's force it on deaf children, but it's important that that option, that facility is there for deaf children, deaf-blind children, no matter where they live in Scotland, that they should be given the opportunity to receive an education in BSL.
Thank you. Could I ask Robert a question on the education? You talk about basically giving that opportunity to children. We were told by witnesses that early intervention is very key. Is that something you agree to, Robert?
100%, yes, definitely. We need to make sure that that support is there for deaf children and deaf-blind children and to their parents and families. Because at the moment, many parents, if they're looking for opportunities to learn BSL, they have to do this independently. Most BSL courses are evening classes for deaf adults who might be thinking about working with deaf people. It's not really designed for parents with deaf children. So if we think about opportunities for parents who want to learn BSL, there are many challenges there.
Thank you.
Just because research has shown that if you give deaf children or a deaf-blind child, like any other child, a rich language environment, then that just opens the doors to, that just opens their potential. I've met many deaf adults who have said, I wish I had the opportunity to learn BSL when I was younger. I wish my parents had the opportunity to learn BSL. I've never met a deaf adult who said, I wish I didn't learn BSL.
Thank you. My next two questions are for Stacey and Rachel. Have you undertaken any monitoring or assessment of how effective your local BSL plans are? And if so, which areas meet the needs for BSL users and which areas may require further work?
I'll respond to that one if that's okay first, and then let Stacey come in. I think. Oh, sorry, I'm just checking. Sorry, can you hear me okay? I don't know if that's coming through. Okay, sorry. Yes, no, thank you for that question. I think certainly for ourselves, we're in the period now where we're doing our kind of first real review and evaluation against our action plan, and that will be fed through our various governance routes, just to ensure across the board that we have that robust scrutiny, and also a period where we will go back to local community members as well, so that we're not just having the scrutiny from colleagues and board members, but also at that local level as well for lived experience. And I think that's where we've seen a real benefit of the partnership working and the power of partnership working with Falkirk Council, because again, there's kind of two separate governance routes, obviously, that our plan goes through. I think, we'd be remiss if we said that there's areas that we've absolutely got 100% correct. I think there's always room for learning and improvement, and we want to make sure that we get this right and make sure that we are making a positive difference to the lives of our local service users. I think we have made a lot of progress, and a lot of great progress in terms of accessibility. So we are, for example, reviewing the ways in which we do appointment letters, so that there's not an over-reliance on asking people to phone in for an appointment, or an over-reliance on English as a first language. So we are looking at ways that we can tailor to really make sure that we aren't negatively impacting from the get-go, from the first point of access for our local community members. But definitely there's a lot more learning and improvement to be made, and it is a continuous improvement journey that we're on as a board, but that we are really committed to, and that the plan definitely helps through that evaluation and constant governance route.
Stacey, do you want to come in any of this?
No, that's good. Thank you. Rachel's covered all the points.
Thank you. I've got one last question. I'm just going to ask the convener. It's question 13. Do I come back after 11:12, or would you like me to ask it now?
It's up to yourself what you would like to ask, Pam.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Again, this question's for Stacey and Rachel. Another issue that frequently came up was the difficulty of accessing NHS services. I have had a constituent who has waited months to access audiology appointments through NHS, and these are people that just need hearing aids. This is even more challenging for someone with complete hearing loss. Witnesses have called for the NHS to be better joined up with local authorities to create a more coherent plan and give deaf people a better chance in life. How can this be done?
So I think certainly that is what we've tried to do with having our plan as a joint plan with Falkirk Council colleagues, and it does put us in the privileged position of being able to have access to each other's information and approach. So, for example, obviously Dr. Adam has said about the importance of education. That's not something we would have direct input to, but we can work closely with Falkirk Council colleagues to get that information and make sure that it's put into practice for ourselves, and vice versa. They can have access to information around accessibility barriers for health appointments. I think, again, that your question, for me, it really comes into the power of intersectionality as well, and knowing that there's accessibility barriers for all when accessing NHS services at the moment, especially given the pressure that is on resources that we have. But we know there's additional pressures for intersectionality individuals where, for example, our BSL users, if they are also rural and also perhaps older adults, there's additional needs and barriers that will be put into place. So that's where we do really have to do kind of personalised individual actions to help support, and where that ongoing work and communication with our local community to be responsive to their needs is important. Certainly a lot of this will be picked up strategically within our population health and care strategy, and that really is looking at how best we use the resources we do have to meet the needs of our local population, and our BSL community members will be right up the centre of that.
Thank you, Rachel. It's really good to hear that Falkirk, obviously, you're engaging with Falkirk Council and working together. I mean, this was one of the areas and issues that came up with witnesses that they felt that, you know, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing because the fact is they're not working together. Can I ask, you may not know this, but I'll ask the question, do you know how many other councils, basically, if this is something that they're all working with councils, or is it something that, you know, that Falkirk is doing with yourselves? Would you or Stacey know that?
So I wouldn't know the exact number. I can certainly go away and kind of find that out and come back to you. I know certainly within our own local area, we have Falkirk Council, but we also have Stirling Council and Clackmannanshire Council. So whilst our joint plan is just with Falkirk Council on this iteration of it, we are still working closely with Stirling and Clack's colleagues and making sure that it is a cross-body representation, and again furthering that with working with Police Scotland and things, with the aim to try and continually further how we have an integrated approach. And that was, as you say, based on feedback from service users of the avoidance of duplication, and again, you know, where there's potentially communication barriers for, like you say, one area knows something and it's not communicated correctly to another. So we are really hopeful that the work with Falkirk Council will be a positive blueprint for how we can expand on that going forward. And I certainly know there's other areas that have done this as gold standards. Stacey might not know more detail, but I know NHS Lanarkshire and I think NHS Lothian have both developed plans that have been made in partnership working with their local authorities.
Thank you. Stacey, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to actually say Lanarkshire, they've done a joint plan with the councils and I believe Police Scotland, as have, I think, Dundee and other places. But it's certainly something that we could find out and come back to you on.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Thank you. We now have a question from Evelyn Tweed, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, panel, and thanks for all your answers so far. They've been very helpful. My question is also about mental health services. The committee have heard that, you know, service provision just isn't good enough, but particularly for deaf young people. And I wanted to ask specifically NHS Forth Valley, what are you doing in this area, and how is this issue being tackled? And I don't know who would like to come in, either Rachel or Stacey.
I'll start on that, please. Thank you. So I could give you some local examples of what we've tried to do recently as part of our action plan for our BSL joint plan. We do know in particular that, as you say, our young people are at additional disadvantages. So what we're trying to do is we've worked with child and adolescent mental health colleagues. Stacey will be able to give a bit more detail, but we've had one initial session with them working with interpreters, so that's both BSL and foreign languages, but looking at ways in which we can make sure information is accurately represented and put across, and really just making sure that lived experience and representation forms a part of their key delivery plans. We attended the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service Senior Leadership Team meeting a couple of weeks ago, myself and senior colleagues from Women and Children's, and that was around the use of equality impact assessments and the UNCRC, building that in to make sure that from the point of creation, the rights of children are input and embedded, and that obviously includes BSL children and young people. So it's really about, for us locally, making sure that it's not done as an afterthought, but done right at the point of creation, and opportunities for co-production with lived experienced individuals are part and parcel of that as well.
Thanks, Rachel. Stacey, would you like to come in?
Yeah, it was just to really sort of echo what Rachel says. We delivered some targeted training to raise awareness and communication with CAMHS and the mental health services. We basically got the BSL interpreters in the room and we discussed how there are different nuances, different things that just didn't work, didn't translate, and how best we can deal with that. We work really closely with CAMHS on an ongoing basis to sort of try and resolve those issues. We've also recently become involved in Ben's Hoos, I can't say it in the Scottish accent, which is basically where children who have had trauma or any a witness to a crime, etc., will go into this specialised area, and we're in the planning stages, and we're in there to advocate for BSL community and how that will work long term. So we are trying.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. That's me, Convener.
Thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I've got two questions, one to Dr. Adam and then and Professor Custers, and then the second question if I also ask both Dr. Adam and Professor Custers. So my first question is that the Act has been in place since 22nd of October 2015, so 10 years. It was an Act of Parliament, Scottish Parliament, and as we know, the Act states that listed authorities had up to 12 months following the launch of the first national plan to publish their own BSL plan. One of the concerns that we have as a committee is that only 62% of local BSL plans were published in BSL at the same time as the English version. So my question is around how you believe we should hold listed authorities to account to meet the publishing requirements of the BSL Act. And if I first can go to Dr. Adam.
Thank you. I agree. Yes, they do need to publish in BSL at the same time as the English. I've checked my local council and their local plan. I won't name and shame, but it's not been published in BSL. So I'm very disappointed to see that. There's a few things there that we need to bear in mind. That if we have deaf experts involved in the development of the plan, then you can easily commission the BSL translation. They would know how to do that. So you need to know where to find a translator to be able to produce that translation. And there are very few deaf translators in Scotland, very, very few. I mean, I can count them on one hand, really, or maximum two hands. There are more local authorities than there are deaf translators available to do the work to translate those local plans. So we do need to capacity build. It comes back to that again. There are deaf people who have the skills to do this job. They need the training and capacity building. So that comes down to commissioning. But it links again to what I would like to ask public bodies in the first place. Is are you getting your narrative clear? Are you actually explaining what needs to be done? Are you being accountable? Are you building in follow-up actions? It comes back to that empowering of the processes and the language that's used.
Thank you. Professor Custers?
I would fully endorse what Dr. Adam has said. I think there's not much more to add, although I think it is important also to think about not focusing on the translation itself. It's more important to think about the process of developing the plan. If you haven't had a deaf person involved or any deaf people involved in the process, then it's tokenistic to have a translation at the end of that. So it should be a whole process approach.
And I suppose the key thing for me is, to me, that's a basic. So you can actually measure other things, but firstly do that the most basic right. So my second question is, my colleague has actually talked earlier about the comparison with Gaelic. So one of the issues that Dr. Adam, you say, is capacity build. And we've heard from the previous two sessions that there is that lack of capacity for various reasons, whether it's lack of interpreters, lack of teachers, lack of training facilities. But then when I'm looking at the comparison to Gaelic to BSL, so there's just over, I think it's just over 2% in Scotland, 2.7% speak Gaelic. I think it's 2.2% BSL users. So they're very similar populations, yet the Scottish Government spend £30 million a year on Gaelic, but I can't find any evidence, and we asked our research team, on how much does the Scottish Government spend on BSL. So, Dr. Adam, you talked about lip service. This is lip service. You can't manage what you don't measure. And as the BDA said, there is limited funding to support any development of the Act and implementation of the Act. So what's your view of that? Firstly, Dr. Adam.
I think since the BSL Act was passed in the Parliament, I have to say it's a very powerful and symbolic. It has led to other nations in the UK thinking similarly about their own BSL Act, so it has a very positive impact. Thank you. It has led the way, and well done to Scotland. But at the same time, we haven't seen that capacity building. We haven't seen a growth in BSL teachers, so people who can actually teach children and families or other professionals. We haven't got that growth in the professionals who can teach BSL. We haven't got any training courses in Scotland to train people to teach BSL. We have interpreter training courses, and we've seen more interpreters coming through, but interpreters are not the answer to this. So we need, like you say, to have more professionals being trained to work with deaf people. Like we've already said, domestic violence advocates, counsellors, therapists. We need that. The Act is 10 years old now. So by now you would expect to see an increase in the number of people who are doing those kinds of work, and we haven't seen that. Which, we don't have BBC BSL Scotland. We don't have a channel. We have BBC Alba, but we don't have. I enjoy watching BBC Alba, but I enjoy watching the Alba channel. But we don't have programmes that are actually out there showcasing BSL culture in Scotland and so on. So we've seen more individuals thinking about how to provide services and things like that. But there hasn't been a big societal impact or a big impact in, a big bang. There's been no big bang since the Act, I think.
Because you said it was lip service. So it's almost aspirational but no implementation. The rubber hasn't hit the road yet.
That's it.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. Professor Custers.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's ironic, in a way, that Gaelic has more funding for people to speak Gaelic than BSL in Scotland, but BSL actually, when you survey, you find, 1,700 people using BSL, whereas in Gaelic it's 69,000. It gets more funding. Sorry.
It's 117,000.
Yes, thank you. Yes, 107. Apologies for voicing that wrong. 117,000 people will sign compared to 69,000 who will speak Gaelic, but Gaelic gets more funding. So I think this is an important point to make. The funding doesn't currently follow. So what we're talking about today, all the things we would like to see, all the aspirations can't happen without funding, and we do absolutely need that.
And then just a final question before I pass back to the convener is, after this session, we have Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, in front of us. What one question would you like us as a committee to ask Kate Forbes? Dr. Adam. So if you could both answer the question, Dr. Adam first and then Professor Custers. One question.
I would personally like to ask, what are you doing for deaf children to ensure that they can acquire BSL as a first language? What's the point of having a BSL Act if you don't make it actually work for deaf children and their families? So if they can't actually access BSL learning, quality BSL input at that stage, what does it mean? Annalise Custers, I absolutely agree. That is the thing.
That's the one question that we need to ask.
Yes.
Thank you. Back to you, convener.
Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Good morning to the panel, and thank you for joining us this morning. I want to just pick up on some of the things that you've been talking about. Annalise, in response to Tessa's questions, you talked about resourcing and that disparity between the number of people who are BSL users and number of people who speak Gaelic and the funding that follows. Are there ways, do you think, that other than just more money, that what resources are available could be used more effectively? Because I think there are challenges. We've heard about education, we've heard about the lack of that understanding of the culture of BSL. How do we make the resources do better for us?
I would say it's down to training more deaf people to do those things. You can't spend more money, but you can train more people. So like Professor Annalise said, increasing the number of interpreters is not going to be the answer. What we've seen in the past, like for example the domestic abuse, you bring in a domestic abuse advocate, you've got professionals there, plus an interpreter, but that's really not what deaf people are looking for. It's not the support that they need. What they want is direct support delivered in BSL. It's like what I said before, we were expecting this. By now, we would have seen the big bang of more professionals with quality BSL providing services to deaf people in different areas. So rather than thinking about this provision is going to cost us money, how are we going to resource this, it should be who can we train to provide this service.
Annalise, do you want to come in?
I agree with Dr. Adams that training is essential. We also need to remember that there are ways that we can celebrate BSL, and we haven't really talked about that. It's a rich, beautiful language. It brings a lot to Scottish culture, and we don't have to go far to see the history. There's lots to celebrate, and I think that's an important part of the BSL Act, which is not only making it more visible, but let's think about how we can celebrate BSL.
Okay, thank you. I think there's something in that culture piece that I hope we can pull out, not only with Kate Forbes, but in our report as well. So thank you for that. Can I come to Stacey and Rachel and ask you both that question of resourcing? Do you see prioritisation being effective, or how would you do things differently in terms of the allocation of resources?
No, thank you. I think for us it's really going back to simplicity. So I think at one of the previous committees it was Alana Harper who brought up the example of a simple solution about kind of laminated sheets for travel routes. And I think certainly locally we've experienced where there's a real power in engagement there. I think if we had failed to engage with our local community, we would perhaps be sitting allocating resources based on solutions that we felt would be best use of resources, but would actually not be what brings the greatest success and effectiveness to the community. So it really is about the power of that engagement, and it's often really simple solutions that are the most effective. So money won't solve everything. It really is about how we reallocate our resources, and I think that's where strategically we have a strong link in terms of our population health and care strategy, which is upcoming, but also the local work we're doing around values-based health and social care. And that is really about making the resources we do have go further in response to that lived experience feedback. And that's where we will really, again, be continuing that engagement with our local community to ask them what would be the best use of resources and how best we can improve their experience and access to healthcare.
Thanks, Rachel. Stacey, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think I'd just like to say, in answer to the previous question of what we'd like to ask Kate Forbes, it would be, are the Scottish Government going to commit to ring-fencing long-term funding to build sort of real BSL capacity? As both people have said there, it's not just about interpreters, it's about mental health counsellors, it's about teachers, it's about getting it sort of right for families at the start so that BSL is learnt from the very start, not just an add-on at some point. I think it's just about that commitment and funding to get more support.
Thanks, Stacey. That's helpful. My final question, if I can come back to Adam and to Dr. Adam and Professor Koosters. it seems, as we've been talking this morning, there are questions for us about what goes into national and local plans, and that the slimming down of, or the watering down of, the second national plan compared to the first. But it also seems to me that actually what's in the plan doesn't necessarily get at the things that, Robert, you were talking about, you know, training more BSL users to be counsellors, to be teachers, to be educators, to be a whole range of different people in their communities, not just interpreters, not just the translators. I'm wondering, are there ways that we can join things up a bit better, or close that gap? Because the plans themselves, whilst there are questions clearly about measurement, about accountability, there's something missing, I think. If all we're doing are measuring the numbers of interpreters, that doesn't actually change the numbers of people, of BSL users who have BSL as a first language, who are teachers, who are nurses, who are doing other things in society, not just doing things as BSL users, interpreters, translators, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. We do need more deaf people, deaf-blind people being given the opportunities to do things. For example, deaf politicians. Mm-hmm. It would be wonderful to see a deaf MSP in this Parliament representing that particular area. And it would, you know, it's having someone from the BSL community. It's not just about seeing deaf people doing things for deaf people. Deaf people can contribute to Scottish life, everyday Scottish society, mainstream society, so including the economy.
Annalise, do you want to?
In terms of measuring change, I think there does need to be more accountability rather than lip service, okay? Because otherwise, other priorities will get in the way. So we need to think about how we make sure that the BSL plan does remain a priority.
And are you both confident that the plan actually can drive that culture change, not only in how BSL users are seen and supported in society, but also in the everything else, the education, the training, the capacity building? Are you convinced that with the right engagement, we've got the right plans? Or is there something else that we're missing in all of this? Robert first.
That's a very difficult one to answer. I want to remain positive because you do have a national plan, whereas many other countries do not have a plan for promoting their national sign languages. So we are leading the way internationally, but there are a number of gaps which I think we've already covered in this session. So education, language acquisition of BSL, the collection of data. So who are using BSL in Scotland? And thinking about how we can increase the number of professionals who are providing a direct service in BSL.
Thank you.
Annalise, there are still many countries that have yet to recognise their national sign languages. So while that's one thing to celebrate, what we do have in common with these other countries is that there's very little provision for deaf children in terms of giving them opportunities to learn their national sign language. Robert, if you don't have a good education system for deaf children, that's only going to lead to mental health issues as these people grow up. So, and that's going to have more impact on resources. So we need to get to the issue very early on, making sure that there are opportunities for deaf children to learn so that they can then go on and have aspirations, career and so on, so that they become more resilient. And the way to do that is to think about how can we use resources earlier on, which in fact will be less expensive at the earlier stage if we try to fix problems at a later stage.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings our first panel to a close. I just want to check with members if they have asked all the questions that they wish to. Yeah, and have the witnesses been able to express everything that they wish to? Would you like to add anything else?
Robert, no, that's it from me. I had the intention or the plan to talk about education, so it's really good that we've had that opportunity to talk about education as well as other issues. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you all very much once again for joining us. That brings our evidence session to a close. We will suspend briefly for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. I would now like to welcome our second panel of witnesses this morning. We have Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Economy and Gaelic. The Deputy First Minister is accompanied by Kevin McGowan, Unit Head Equality Division, Andrew Godfrey Mears, BSL and Social Isolation Policy Manager, Alison Taylor, Deputy Director for Improvement, Attainment and Wellbeing, and Robert Eckert, Additional Support for Learning Policy Team Leader. You're all very welcome this morning. Thank you for attending. We would now like to invite the Deputy First Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks to the committee for having us here and also taking the time to do an inquiry into the BSL Scotland Act 2015. I want to say at the outset how much I look forward to the committee's recommendations off the back of the evidence, because this is an issue of such importance that I think it calls on the best participation of the Parliament and also the lived experience of those who have given evidence to you over the course of the last few weeks. As the committee knows, and I assume this is partly why you're taking the evidence, this year is a very important year for BSL in Scotland because it marks the 10th anniversary since the British Sign Language Act 2015 was passed. And of course it offers an important opportunity to reflect on what progress has been made, but also on what further action is required to improve the lives of BSL users. And as I have myself engaged with BSL users over the course of the last few weeks, I'm very conscious of their feedback, reflecting on areas where they think that strides have been made, progress has been made, but also areas where they think the government can go further. And those are the areas that I'm keen to work on a cross-party basis to do that. And that builds on Scotland's heritage as a nation, because Scotland, of course, holds a significant place in the rich culture and history of British Sign Language. And I'm very delighted to have responsibility for BSL under the languages portfolio which I hold. Particular thanks to the convener for her ongoing contribution and her role as a member of the cross-party group on deafness and her ongoing advocacy for the BSL community, not least in rating my progress in actually using BSL, which is slower than I would like. At the heart of the BSL National Plan 2023 to 2029 is a focus on accessibility and tackling the systemic barriers that are faced by BSL users in their daily lives, whether that's in the realm of education, health, justice or culture. And the 10 priority themes in the plan are areas that the community themselves have told us are important to them. To successfully deliver on that plan, we have spent the first year building the infrastructure to deliver for BSL users in Scotland. And crucial to that has been the formation of the Implementation Advisory Group, which is made up of key organisations that represent BSL users in Scotland. And I want to thank the group for their continued support as they work with us to provide accountability on the actions in the plan. In addition to that, my officials have been building connections across government and across devolved nations to support and monitor actions in the plan, to share knowledge, lived experience and best practice to ensure that BSL users are factored into all policy decisions. And as we progress with the second year of the plan, we'll be focused on delivery across government, and officials are continuing to check on the progress of actions to provide and support to the community for policy teams and looking for opportunities to strengthen work. So my last concluding remark is to acknowledge the role that listed authorities and their local plans play in realising the ambitions of the BSL National Plan. And while it's important that I am here with accountability for progress on the plan, I think it's also important to note that it isn't only government that is responsible for delivery here. It is also for other listed authorities to do so likewise. So I look forward to hearing the committee's questions. I'm sure there will be things for us to take away, and I've got an able panel here of officials covering a number of different areas who will respond on areas that precede my time in this role. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. We're now going to move on to questions, and I'm going to start us off. We've been hearing from witnesses that the BSL Act has improved visibility and awareness of BSL in Scotland, and even praised that Scotland has been a leader in this, with recognising it as an official language, and also praised for the engagement with the BSL community. But there has also been some criticisms in regard to perhaps the delivery of service, capacity building, the lack of interpreters and teachers of BSL. Can I ask you, what do you think is the positive impacts of the BSL Act, but also what have been the main challenges in delivery of the aims?
Thanks very much, Convener. So I think in terms of progress that we have seen, the points you made there around promotion is important, and also accountability. So for this to be effective, we do need to see implementation and delivery right across people's experiences. So I listed some of the spheres, and within each of those spheres, I think, so for example, education, justice, healthcare, and so on. Within each of these spheres, we can point to progress that have been made, but we can also point to areas that BSL users identify are still gaps. So, for example, around education, I know that the committee has heard evidence around ensuring that the quality of BSL, or the depth of BSL fluency, as it were, is there, that there are enough opportunities to for BSL users to themselves become teachers, and there's a consultation on that that is live just now. There are also areas where I have heard how effective a specialist BSL social worker has been, and then others saying that they too would like to be able to access specialist BSL social workers. And obviously that is something that we need to work with local authorities on, who are primarily responsible around social work. So I think that's examples where one person's experience of high quality, excellent provision might be another person's experience of aspiring to receive the same. And it is that consistency of provision across Scotland, which I would say is both the strengths of the progress in Scotland, because it speaks to delivery, but also the areas that we need to do more on, because there are still gaps in provision.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. I appreciate that those gaps have been highlighted, and that is being considered by the government. We have also taken evidence from deaf-blind tactile BSL users, and they feel that there perhaps hasn't been enough parity of esteem or parity in regards to education for tactile BSL. Can I ask what are your reflections on that?
So our responsibility is to improve the quality of life for BSL users, especially deaf and deaf-blind BSL users. So in terms of that parity of esteem, we have to, and we do currently, work with key partners who represent both the deaf and deaf-blind communities in Scotland. That is part of the Implementation Advisory Group, and they are the ones that ultimately provide accountability on the actions in the plan, and provide their experience to help strengthen its delivery. The point is, it's not just me telling the committee where I believe progress has or hasn't been made. We have the Implementation Advisory Group who are involved with, and key partners are involved with them, who represent deaf-blind communities, and they are the ones who advise us as to whether or not progress is being made. So in terms of your question, I think your question was whether there was parity of esteem between all BSL users, if that was correct. Yeah. And I wanted to stress that the partners who represent deaf-blind and deaf communities are represented on the Implementation Advisory Group. I don't know if Kevin or Andrew want to say any more.
Yeah, just to highlight that we fund Deafblind Scotland through the Equality and Human Rights Fund, and part of that funding that we give to them is to advise us on the issues that deafblind people face in Scotland and the barriers in particular that they are up against. So that's very much part of our policy work with Deafblind Scotland.
Thank you. We've heard much praise for Contact Scotland BSL and how it has been a lifeline for BSL users and life-changing in some regard. We've also heard some evidence this morning on some issues with that in regards to quality and appropriateness of interpreters in different situations. But overall, Contact Scotland has been quite a significant improvement for the lives of BSL users. Unfortunately, though, there has been that concern and perhaps threats to that service. Can I ask you, Deputy First Minister, what can the Scottish Government do to just ensure that this service stays and possibly improved as well, if that's...
I think, Convener, the way that you characterise the evidence you've heard on Contact Scotland is consistent with the evidence that we have heard, which is that for some users, they're very satisfied, they're very happy with the service. But there are others, and I've heard directly from them, who feel that there are areas that that service could be significantly improved if they were to use it. So we know that the total number of people who use that service currently is not the full number of BSL users who need to use a service. In other words, it's a responsibility on us to take on board both the positive feedback and some of the more negative feedback. And that is why we have been in active consultation with the community and are currently in live procurement for a new service. The 2 points I want to stress is that I regret hugely any alarm that was caused with the communication around a new procurement round and the fears that gave rise to. I think that since then, the efforts at consulting, I've certainly attended a number of different groups to hear directly from BSL users, and the fact that we're now in a live procurement process, I think is very encouraging. The second thing I wanted to stress is that there will be no break in provision. That is the commitment that we gave to the community, and that is a commitment that we stand by. And on the timing, once the procurement process completes, we're very hopeful that there will be a new service in place as quickly as possible, and there will certainly be no break in services for BSL users as we transition to a new contract. If there's any other details, Convener, that you would like to know about that process, then I'm very happy to ask a colleague to come in.
No, that's great, thank you so much. If there's anything your colleagues would like to add, that would be helpful.
Yes, just to highlight that through the community engagement process, what came out very clearly was the fact that BSL users really value the service, the ones who use it. They see it as being an independent lifeline, and that is something we've taken on board with regards to designing a new service. So we are in a live procurement stage just now. We held an industry event in which potential suppliers came forward. There was a healthy number of potential suppliers at that event, which gives me faith that competitive bids will come forward, and it will be really interesting to see how the market responds to the specification the government has put out, and to see what they can do with advances in technology and how they respond to community needs. So it's an exciting phase of the procurement process, and I look forward to the next stage, which come July, when the bids close and we undertake the evaluation.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Paul O'Kane, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the Deputy First Minister and officials. I think it's fair to say that already in the evidence we've heard, there have been mixed views in terms of the National BSL Plan, the second plan. I think, we've heard some of the commentary about the positives, I think, but also I think people's concerns, particularly that it lacks focus, it doesn't have measurable goals, timelines or accountability. And I think we've also heard criticism that the plan's been watered down from where we originally were in terms of the evidence that was given around the preparation of that plan. So I think it would be useful, firstly, if the Deputy First Minister was able to perhaps just respond to those criticisms, that indeed the plan was watered down from the draft version.
I'm not aware of it having been watered down. The BSL National Plan is a 6-year plan, so it represents our commitment to improving lives. And it's important to state that we are committed to delivering on the plan, but we are also committed to responding to feedback. It's not that the BSL plan, as it were, is so rigid that if the community make representations in another area where they feel that more progress needs to be made or issues need to be strengthened, that we ignore that. So it is heavily informed by consultation with the community itself, but I want, and those actions are all chosen because they address the barriers that were identified by BSL users in their daily lives. But as all lawmakers and representatives will know in the Parliament, the plan is there, it provides focus, it provides strategic focus. In a sense, it is a means by which all parts of government can get behind the plan, because the nature of any language, as it were, is that it cuts across all spheres of government. So it isn't just the remit of the BSL team to implement the plan. It requires change from education, justice and so on. And having the national plan brings together requires responsibility to be taken by other areas of government. But it also requires us to respond to the feedback that we hear on a regular basis. So where something, so for example, the procurement round for BSL, for Contact Scotland, the process, the specifications that Kevin just mentioned are in response to the consultation. So it happens independently of the national plan. So ultimately, the value of this plan will be in whether on an annual basis we can point to tangible changes that have improved people's lives in the BSL community. And I think any plan is only as strong as its implementation.
So I think there's 2 points in what you've just said. One is that you don't recognise watering down. However, you would recognise that there is criticism of the plan that has been watered down. So you have Rachel O'Neill from Murray House in Edinburgh, who was consulted. Her research was incorporated into the draft. That was along with Dr Rob Wilkes of UWE Bristol. However, they were then disappointed when their recommendations were removed from the draft. So it was their view that that then had been removed or had been watered down. So it would be useful, I think, for committee to understand why that decision was taken in the final draft. And why we now have this sense of people feeling that things had been watered down. And I suppose on your last point in response there around the progress will be measured in tangible outcomes, I mean, a lot of the criticism we are hearing is that there aren't measurable things in this plan, that there's not a sense that we're going to measure targets. So I appreciate you're saying that today, but I mean, is it your view that there should be measurable outcomes?
So I'm going to ask an official to come in on the process, because I accept that I wasn't here just for managing the process. On the criticisms, I have been following the committee's evidence. So I've certainly heard the same evidence that the member will have heard from some that you reference. I'm conscious of some of the commentary, for example, from BDA Scotland about how comprehensive this plan was versus the first plan, and some of the areas where they would have liked to have seen it go further. So it was just to give reassurance that in the spirit of always seeking to listen to those with lived experience and those who are key partners in representing the community, I do not dismiss their feedback, and I'm very happy to engage on that feedback and where we can respond to some of those points that have been made independently of the plan. How can we respond? And I think there's some particularly interesting remarks, and we may get onto this in a more substantive question from Rachel O'Neill around education, which I was quite struck by in terms of it reflecting some of the other comments that I'd heard from engaging with community groups. So I'll ask one of the team to come in on the process, but just on monitoring plans. So there is an action within the BSL national plan that focuses on the sharing of best practice. So developing that with the listed authorities for how do they effectively implement and deliver their plans? Because if you have every listed authority, including the Scottish Government, taking ownership of delivering their element to the best of their ability and seeking excellence and effective implementation, then I think you completely shift the dial in improving, in removing the barriers that BSL users face. There is a challenge in terms of our regulatory role in relation to the Act. So it's up to listed authorities to comply with legislation by publishing local plans in accordance with the Act. And we look at how we can support them to do that and fill any gaps that are identified. And I suppose that's maybe the difference between a carrot and a stick. And I don't know if that's maybe what some of the evidence was getting at, that there's support there in place. We encourage listed authorities in particular to engage with BDA Scotland. We fund BDA Scotland. And we ask local listed authorities to seek BDA Scotland's support and to work with them to engage with BSL users. But that is all part of a process that is encouraging rather than necessarily regulating. And that may be quite a critical difference. Does someone want to talk about the process?
Yes. Just to say, as part of the consultation process, we consulted widely as part of the BSL national plan. There was nothing left off the table in terms of discussion and ideas as part of that process. But what we had to do was distill the main actions for the plan into deliverable actions that would develop outcomes for BSL users. So that's why some things did not make the final cut and why others were put in the plan so that they could actually kind of change and shift the dial for BSL users. But what we did do in terms of setting up the implementation advisory group, and we say in the plan that there are key areas of focus that group would want to revisit. And those were areas that came out of the consultation, which maybe were more difficult to deliver on within the 6-year period, but it was never to say they were off the table or we shouldn't start to make the first steps in relation to that. So that was the approach taken for the process. And then just on the targets and monitoring, so every action within the plan has been identified as either been short-term, medium-term or longer-term. And we monitor those actions based on that process. We do that on a regular basis across government, given many actions sit in other areas of government, but also bring that information to the Implementation Advisory Group. And of course, under the Act, we will produce a progress report in year 3. So in 2026, we'll produce that progress report and we can detail more succinctly what the status of each action actually is.
So, I mean, I appreciate what the Deputy First Minister is saying in terms of a carrot and a stick approach and trying to encourage people to engage in best practice. But, you know, the Deputy First Minister is very committed to delivery in terms of government policy and in terms of overarching policy. So, you know, what scope does she feel there is to revisit the idea that there should be measurable goals, timelines and accountability? Because I appreciate what Mr McGowan has just said about taking stock at the end of that 3-year period. But, you know, in terms of getting there, is the Deputy First Minister committed to seeing more tangible timescales?
I am always keen to see tangible evidence of delivery. And I think particularly when it relates to people's lives and the barriers they face, I think it's difficult not to be inspired and moved in equal measure when engaging with the BSL community about the barriers that they face and also the opportunities that are to support the removal of those barriers. There is a statutory element to all of this. So, you know, there are legal implications. There is a statutory requirement for listed authorities to meet their statutory requirements within the Act. The point I was making about regulation is that the Scottish Government doesn't have a regulatory role from the Act, but local authorities have a responsibility to ensure they are complying with the legislation and publishing their plans in line with statutory deadline and delivering on those plans. So there is the backstop of what the legislation requires of listed authorities. And I'm very happy to reflect, particularly if this comes out of the committee's evidence, very happy to reflect on what further steps can be taken to ensure that local delivery. We have a duty to deliver. You hold us accountable for what we do or don't deliver, rightly so. When it comes to the national plan, the same will go for other listed authorities. And I think it is all of the public sector taking ownership for how to remove those barriers. And if there is a tool or an instrument or a means by which we can make that happen more effectively, I'm very, very open to that.
Well, I mean, I think that's useful because I think what we've heard is a concern about the lack of central oversight of all of that. And in our evidence this morning, for example, we had a discussion around the lack of a body, if you like, or a formal body. And I appreciate what the Deputy First Minister says about perhaps the legislative constraint. However, you know, if we can make a comparison to Gaelic, and I don't do this in a sort of trying to pit two things against each other, because I'm supportive of the Gaelic language as well, and we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion this afternoon, obviously, on those issues. But, you know, I think what we heard this morning was, for example, the Board na Gaelic has a very clear role very often, and is perhaps that central sort of oversight, if you like, organisation. We don't have a similar for BSL, and that was obviously of concern to the witnesses who gave that evidence. So the Deputy First Minister says she's open to that conversation or a potential recommendation, but I wonder if she might want to just reflect on that and those comparisons.
Yeah, they're very interesting comparisons, and what you will get from me is an openness to radical ideas for how to accelerate progress. But you'll also get from me a strong desire to only take action that the community ask us to take, in the sense that sometimes you can go ahead and build well-meaning infrastructure that is not in the best in the best interest or being demanded by the community, because a more decentralised approach is more effective. Now, I am open to suggestions. We have some very, very effective partner organisations. I mentioned BDA Scotland, for example, who are effective representatives, but also have a role in advising, guiding, supporting listed authorities and others, including us, for how to take action. So I guess I'm neither shutting down your idea here, but neither am I saying let's do it, because we have to do everything through careful consultation and understanding what kind of structures would be most effective. I don't know if the team want to say anything further about that, or if that's...
Yes, I mean, the community themselves, so BDA Scotland and the Alliance, have spoken to us at length around the possibility of setting up a network which enables those discussions to take place, to share best practice and to involve the community so that it's more of a kind of a live reactionary feature to any policies or emergent issues that take place, and that's something we are considering. That is something that merits further discussion, because that again has been derived from the community.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason I asked the question. The evidence we heard was from people who use BSL, and I think the contention this morning was it's the users of the language who have to be at the heart of that. So that's why I raised the point. And I think it's useful to hear there's an openness to it, and I'm sure we will want to reflect that in terms of the work we are doing. I'm quite content to hand back, Convener. I hope those questions were substantive enough.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Deputy First Minister and your officials. I think it's important there's a joint working in the development of local plans, and I'm particularly interested to know what leadership and direction has been provided by the Scottish Government to listed authorities in supporting the development of the BSL plans.
So in terms of the local plans, there's obviously a requirement for those local plans to be published. And we have, in terms of the duties under the BSL Scotland Act 2015, we have a duty to publish our national plan outlining what we will do during the period to promote and facilitate the promotion and understanding of BSL in Scotland as per the Act. We consult with the deaf community when drafting the plan, as is required by the Act. And then we continue to work with key partners to represent the deaf and deafblind communities in Scotland as part of the Implementation Advisory Group to provide that accountability. And then, as Kevin said earlier, we have a duty to publish a progress report halfway. So that's the requirement on us. In terms of for listed authorities, it's a responsibility for listed authorities under the BSL Scotland Act to ensure that local plans are published and implemented as well. We recognise the role that councils and their employees play in communities across Scotland, and we believe that through that sort of local consultation, local engagement, local understanding of what citizens want to see in their local areas, it's important then that the local plans reflect those requirements. I've talked then a little bit around what happens next, which is around the sharing of best practice and so on. But we want to support listed authorities. We are looking always at ways to fill any gaps in advice and guidance and so on. But we do want to be crystal clear that all of us, all partners, share a responsibility for their statutory, the sort of implementation of their duties. And the reason I stress that is because of this tension between firm control from the centre to direct and dictate what happens in every local area versus an understanding that every listed authority, every layer of government has their own duties. And I guess having 2 weeks ago engaged with the deliberative process in the Highland Council area, the issues that BSL users in the Highland Council area are talking about are quite remarkably different from what I heard from BSL users in the middle of Edinburgh. And that illustrates for me my apprehension about taking an overly directional role from the centre that misses those distinctive local nuances. So that was quite a long answer for quite a short question.
Appreciative long, but I think for the committee to understand that as well. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. We now have a question from Evelyn Tweed, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Deputy First Minister and panel, and thanks for all your answers so far. My question is also around BSL local plans. We've heard they're high level. There's a lack of consistency across Scotland. But Deputy First Minister, what monitoring, you've touched on this already, what monitoring is the government doing to show us what's working, what's not working, what do we need to do better?
Yeah. So the specific two routes for monitoring are, firstly, our own progress report halfway through the lifespan of the plan. So we'll work with the Implementation Advisory Group on the national plan to ensure that that reflects the experiences of BSL users. So that will be a report. It will be in black and white. It will be published, and it will be clear about what progress has been made or hasn't been made for committee, I'm sure, to scrutinise. The other form of monitoring is this engagement across all the listed authorities for sharing best practice. And we fund, as I said earlier, BDA Scotland to help support those listed authorities as they develop and implement their plans. So it's an ongoing iterative process. Now, I'm aware, listening to committee, that I get the strong impression that you're keen for us to explore a third alternative to those first two. And I'm certainly open to doing that, because we want to understand how to ensure there is best practice across all the different listed authorities. And we're also aware of the Alliance's recent report on local plans as well. And we engage regularly with them as part of the Implementation Advisory Group. So I'm very, very open to anything that the committee believes we can do more around the monitoring, while stressing that point around sometimes monitoring morphs into direction. And I think there are reasons why in this particular subject area, direction from the centre isn't always the most effective way of progressing matters, particularly when you then create national targets that may distort what a local area wants to actually prioritise.
Thank you. And now questions from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I've got a few questions around the implementation of the Act. So, Deputy First Minister, you say that any plan is only as strong as its implementation. And thank you also for the intent to shift the dial. And I've heard both you this morning say that and Mr McGowan say that. So in terms of shifting the dial, there is recognition that there is a lack of complete implementation of the Act. You know, in terms of, we've got the figure of 62% of BSL plans having having the sign language. So, in terms of implementation, we've heard from the BDA that there's inconsistency across Scotland, there's lack of accountability, and there's limited funding to support plans. So, is there monitoring of the spend on BSL? So we know that the spend on Gaelic and Scots is £30 million a year, and that covers, at the moment, 2.5% of the population speak Gaelic or Scots, and almost the same, 2.2%, are BSL users. The Scottish Government manages and sets a budget for Gaelic and Scots, but doesn't seem to know what it spends on BSL. The question is why?
So on the points that BDA made around accountability and implementation, and I think the point around inconsistency. So that reflects, I think, fairly my comments at the outset in relation to the convener's first question, which was, in some areas you've got really high quality, excellent provision, a very positive response to that. And in other areas, they say, we want what they've got. So the point is that consistency across the country. So I take on board the criticism about the inconsistency. In terms of the accountability and tracking the spend, we obviously invest considerably in organisations that work with and represent deaf BSL users and deafblind people in Scotland. So we've referenced some of them already. So BDA Scotland, Scottish Minority Ethnic Deaf Charity and Deafblind Scotland. And then separately, we are investing funding in improving services. So even on areas like, I don't know if the committee's been cited on some of the work we've done through the Scottish Government's CivTech programme in improving accessibility to BSL interpreters. So all of that can be very closely monitored and evaluated. There is a difference between Gaelic, and this may not be a difference that the committee is willing to tolerate. The feedback might be, no, we want you to see you change this. There is a difference because of the responsibility on listed authorities. So some of the areas around, for example, specialist BSL social workers, that is the responsibility of local authorities. So therefore, it would be for local authorities. So tracking the spend does become more challenging when there are areas of responsibility on local authorities. I would say the difference with Gaelic is that it's far more, it's managed on a more national level rather than on a more local level. So there may be points there around whether or not Scottish Government should take responsibility for more funding from the centre that then becomes specialist funding, which would be a difference in how things have been approached so far, which is about more mainstreaming. So as local authorities get their pot of funding, and then they determine how that is spent. So that is a difference, and perhaps leads to the challenge around tracking the money because it's happening at a local and a national level. The one point of challenge I would make is that sometimes the temptation is to say, bring it back to the centre. So you bring it back, and then we get into the difficulty I referenced earlier, where you then have Scottish Government determining that every part of Scotland should get an allocated pot for this service and that service and that service, which may mean that some local authority areas find themselves focusing on a particular priority which may not be the top priority. So, for example, in the Highland Council area, their argument would be that even though they have the training provision for BSL, their big challenge is recruitment. Another area may actually have exhausted the funding for training and actually need more funding for the training because there's an ample supply of people who are interested. So I think there's just some elements. None of these are insurmountable. So they are all, we can overcome them all, and the committee's challenge is helpful in that regard. But does anybody want, Kevin, do you want to add anything to that point around accountability and tracking spend?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose given the Scottish Government does not have a regulatory function under the BSL Act, then it is over to listed authorities to determine what their spend will be locally, and that may be based on the number of deaf or deafblind BSL users within their area or their service. So it does make tracking more difficult from a government point of view. But that's why we have that action within the plan around engaging and sharing best practice to help us understand what it is like from a local delivery perspective.
That, however, feels very having because if you've got an act that received royal assent 10 years ago, and I mean we're having 4 sessions on this, and the evidence demonstrates there is a lack of implementation, then there is a huge issue. So I'd just put it to you, might you be willing to consider a change in approach, because you can't manage what you don't measure.
So I think we will agree to take that point away. I do have extensive experience now around the structures of how Gaelic language is managed. I think they are different, but I think it shows us that there is an alternative route. This is 2 different ways, and it is to do, as Kevin said, around the original statutory responsibilities on government as a regulator, as not as a regulator. But I think that the committee are obviously identifying an area of tracking, of monitoring. I think what you're talking about is compelling as well. to ensure that progress is made. And I think that is something that we would need to consult with local authorities carefully, and also consult with BSL users carefully.
Thank you. And in terms of, you ask for ideas and thoughts, what we're being told from the consultation process, and it was an extensive consultation process, and right across Scotland, in terms of shortage of education facilities, lack of evidence of implementation of plans, lack of classes teaching BSLs, and lack of interpreters. So there is something that you can take away and implement on. So, and thank you for recognising that. Any thoughts, Deputy First Minister, on those four things?
I think these are very timely questions, because there's quite a number of either changes being proposed in education or changes that are currently being consulted on that have particular relevance to BSL users, including in the education bill, which is at stage 3 next week, on the parity of esteem point, and also support for training facilities. So I'm going to ask, if it's okay, either Alison Taylor or Robert to come in.
Yes, I'll start, if that's okay, DFM, and then I'll ask Robert to contribute as well. That's absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of work underway in the education portfolio in relation, in the broad context, to additional support for learning, which is the context within which BSL sits in our policy work. We have a review going to start in the next parliamentary term. Ms Gilruth, the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, has recently committed to that. But we also, right now, have a consultation underway around the guidance that supports the requirements for teachers' regulations, for instance, which set out the training and qualifications that teachers require to have in order to support the BSL community of learners. Robert, would you like to say a bit more on that?
Yes, thank you, committee. So, yes, the guidance is around as Alison says, the requirements for teachers to gain appropriate qualification, and for teachers of the deaf, so relevant for the BSL users in schools. And the guidance is from 2007, and the consultation's out, and we have put forward an amended set of guidelines for what those competencies should be for teachers of the deaf, and in particular BSL language level that those teachers should have, and the length of time they are required to gain the appropriate level of qualification. So that consultation is out until July, and it's those are areas we'd welcome feedback and views on, and take into account the points made in the evidence and by committee members. And that will allow us, following that and the publication of the revised guidance, to look more closely at the teachers of the deaf workforce.
And thank you. If I can make a comment on that, and then I've got my final question. What we're being told is that BSL is very much an afterthought with education. And I give an example of the Education Scotland bill. And it wasn't, BSL wasn't factored in at the outset. It came in at the end with amendments, and that is upsetting to the deaf community. So that's almost feedback and a takeaway. My question really, and this was from the previous panel, we said we've got the Deputy First Minister in front of us next. What one question would you like us to ask her and her officials? And correct me if I've got it wrong, but I think the question was, what are you going to do to ensure deaf children are all trained to use BSL in Scotland?
Thank you. Before I answer that, if this is your last question, can I commit, convener, to come back to committee at a time of your choosing once the consultation has closed for this teacher qualification point, and to essentially summarise what we are going to do next on ensuring that some of the criticisms that have been made around the number of teachers with BSL at a suitable level for training teachers, teaching young BSL users to summarise precisely what we are going to do. Because I think the points that are made around young BSL users seem to me to all come back to 2 points. One, the number of suitably trained teachers in BSL to ensure that every young person has access to a teacher, so the number of teachers, and secondly, to ensure that they are a level which actually means that the young person is competent in BSL. So if you are not able to train them at a young age, they then miss out on opportunities for the rest of their lives. And what I've heard from my engagement is that firstly, they have to have a teacher, but you can't just make it any teacher. So the second point is that that teacher has to be trained to a suitably high level. So that is the answer. Enough teachers that are trained to a suitably high level so that every young person has access. And I would like to come back, convener, if it's okay, once this consultation is closed, for us to tell you what precisely we are going to do to make sure that that happens.
And can I just check, when you come back, is that before the end of the year?
Well, I would like it to be. I would like it to be, because if it's not before the end of the year, then we don't have that long before Parliament. When does the consultation close again? Sorry?
The consultation closes in July.
July. That's what I was thinking. So maybe in the early autumn.
Thank you, because we're discussing our work programme and we'll build that in. Thank you. Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much. I know that we're coming short of time now, but we still have a couple of members who'd like to come in on some questions. And firstly, we'll go to Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, Deputy First Minister and officials. Thank you for all the information you've provided so far. I'm going to turn my questions around a little bit because you've been talking about education. I'd like to come in education first. In the committee's private sessions, we heard from deaf pupils and parents who said that in many cases, pupils placed in mainstream schools face difficulties as there were not enough BSL specialists. As teachers, we're not properly equipped to deal with the needs of deaf pupils. One of the pupils we spoke to said that it was difficult to keep up with the work and therefore she failed her exams. Witnesses expressed their disappointment with the government's education bill by saying that it does not deliver for deaf people. You know, it would be great to hear from you, Deputy First Minister, how we can improve the outcomes for deaf children. And I know that Alison and Robert have touched on that there's quite a bit of work being done. It would be good to hear about that. But also earlier on, Dr Robert Adam this morning said that what are the ramifications? You need accountability, otherwise it's just lip service. So you can see that this clearly is a big issue out there, and I'd like to hear that, what plans you have to sort this.
Thanks very much. So let me take on board those comments particularly, and I have to say that, again, through my own consultation or engagement, some of the most inspiring conversations have been with young people, including young people who are still in school, and I'm very inspired by their comments around what we need to do. So the Additional Support for Learning Act places education authorities, who are also the listed authorities in relation to local plans, under duties to identify, to provide for and to review the additional support needs of their pupils, and that includes all deaf children. And the level of support that is required, something that's been clear to me as well, the level of support required and the input from a specialist teacher of deaf children and young people is going to vary depending on a child's individual needs. But we have to, therefore, support staff to increase the capacity of those in schools to provide effective support to deaf pupils. Now, we provide specific grant funding for the Scottish Sensory Centre to support that staff training in particular. And we also fund Call Scotland, who provide advice and training to support staff in the use of assistive technology when working with children and young people with specific communication and sensory needs like hearing and or sensory impairments. Education Scotland has also got a professional learning resource to support practitioners to engage more effectively with British Sign Language users. And the SQA offers qualifications in BSL in the forms of awards from level 3 to level 6. And we also track the number of secondary school leavers who are deaf from publicly funded schools in Scotland to see how many are in a positive destination 9 months after the end of the school year. And that has increased in the last few years. So that is what we are doing. But the evidence that you've just shared with me and the evidence that I have heard still talks about the sense that for some young people, they are not getting the full package of support that they want, that enables them to contribute as fully, participate as fully as they want to. And for me, the answer comes in the answer I gave to Tess White, which is to make sure that there is the right number of teachers with the appropriate training. And some of the criticism I've heard is that there are teachers, but perhaps they're not at an advanced level of training, and therefore a young person doesn't get the full advanced experience that they could. So I think that is something that I am very conscious of, and why I'd very much like to come back to committee once we've done a little bit more work off the back of your evidence to say, right, how can we go further in filling the gaps of young people's experiences?
Thank you for that, Deputy First Minister. Just on that, one of the things the witnesses said that we need level 3 needed for all deaf school teachers, so that will be something if you can look at. That's what they've said. And also there's opportunities as well. They said that people that are already deaf, blind, that they can help being teachers as well, and they can help in the system, so that may be something for you to look at. I've got another 2 questions. 2 weeks ago, the committee heard from Lucy Clark, who is a deaf survivor of domestic abuse. She said that there was only 3 BSL-trained domestic abuse advocates in Scotland, all based in Dundee. Lucy said that finding an interpreter is always at the forefront of a deaf woman's mind, and that many interpreters find it challenging to cover areas of domestic abuse. Deaf women already face so many day-to-day challenges, and it's even more harrowing to know that when a woman needs support the most, it's not there. Deputy First Minister, what is being done to help women like Lucy?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for sharing that. And I know Pam Gossel will be very aware of all the work that we are doing around domestic abuse and the funding that is available there. And of course, that needs to also take into account BSL users. But let me take that, therefore, more widely, if that's okay, to BSL users' experience in the justice system. Because in the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill that we're currently working on an amendment to remove the legislative barrier that currently prevents people with certain physical disabilities from serving as jurors as well. We think that we need to make more progress in and around BSL users' experiences of participating in the justice system. And that is not only in terms of supporting them as survivors, but also supporting them to participate in every aspect of the justice system. Because you and I know that often the case is, if you don't have representation from that community in every aspect of the justice system, you are less likely to see progress. And we are also we also think it's important to roll out different forms of support. So different types of communication supporters are allowed to be present in the deliberation room at a later stage through the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill. There is the BSL Justice Advisory Group as well, which was established in February 2020, and that brings together a number of different organisations to provide expertise and guidance to justice and legal agencies, and that meets quarterly to discuss and monitor implementation of solutions for BSL users. So I I'm happy to go into more detail about equally safe and so on, but there is funding there available to fund organisations. But I also think that this question is about more than just domestic abuse and experience of survivors. It's also about how you adapt the entirety of the justice system to take into account BSL users, so that, and I just think the more representation you have, the easier it therefore becomes for survivors experiencing the justice system.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. My last question. Another issue highlighted by Lucy Clark was that many times deaf women assume that domestic abuse is normal behaviour and do not even know what consent means. While working on my Prevention of Domestic Abuse Scotland bill, I came across a woman who actually had a slurred speech and who said that her abuser had told authorities at the time when the police was up that she was drunk and therefore not taken seriously. Data collection is key to having a clear picture as to which communities are more likely to be affected by domestic abuse. And that is why my Prevention of Domestic Abuse Scotland bill places a requirement on authorities to collect data such as age, sex, disability and ethnicity. Deputy First Minister, do you have the figures to hand on the percentage of deaf women who are survivors of domestic abuse? And do you agree that accurate data collection is key to understanding which communities are most likely to be affected by domestic abuse?
I don't have the figures to hand, and I do completely agree on the importance of data. And I was conscious that in some of the earlier evidence sessions it was particularly referenced the impact of domestic abuse on BSL users. Data is important. I think training within the justice system is important to recognise so that issues like examples like you have just referenced don't happen. And I think that representation of BSL users in all parts of the justice system is also important. So, important monitoring of data. Secondly, important training within the justice system. And thirdly, important representation in terms of access of BSL users to all parts of the justice system, I think are three ways in which we try and tackle what is a completely abhorrent issue in society.
No, thank you very much, Deputy First Minister, because right now data is not collected when these crimes are reported to Police Scotland. Certain data is collected if I was to go in, yes, my name, but and some other details, but right now ethnicity isn't being collected, and also disability is a big one as well, so that's why I'm putting that through in my bill. But thank you very much for shining a light on the importance of those 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have questions from Maggie Chapman.
Thanks very much, Karen, and good morning, Deputy First Minister. Thank you for being here, and to your officials as well for your contribution so far. My question kind of picks up on some of the things you've already touched on, and maybe trying to bring this together. We heard very clearly in the panel just before you this morning, yes, and previously, yes, we can look at the national and local plans, we can identify gaps in what they cover at all, as well as issues with how we monitor and evaluate and track progress. But one of the things that actually isn't really apparent, and I'd be interested in your views, is how can we capture a sense of and therefore the development of the culture of BSL and the culture of BSL users in Scotland. It's, we heard this morning very, very strongly that BSL in Scotland has a really important legacy within BSL across the UK, probably further afield as well. And yet we don't see that element being tracked in any other plans. We don't see that understood. We don't see that. We can talk about capacity building for BSL users to support them to be teachers, nurses, whatever, but we're not talking about the whole human. And I wonder how you think, or where you see we could do work on that.
Yeah. So stop me if I've misunderstood the question, but I think I've understood it. I was really struck as part of a conversation a couple of weeks ago, as I say, in Inverness, and was engaging with representatives of the BSL community in the Highlands who were talking about the different idioms, the different accents, the different words that are used even within Scotland versus the Highlands and Edinburgh and Glasgow, for example. And was very struck just about that rich heritage at that point that you make, which actually is also an argument for a very decentralised approach, I think, in supporting the different communities. And one lady was referencing the fact that she had moved to the Highlands and had to pick up all of the new terminology when she came. And then the second point is that I alluded to it in my remarks, but I've been so struck by the pivotal role that Scotland has played for 200 years, 250 years in terms of BSL provision. And having had, the point was put to me that because Scotland had some of the first educational facilities for deaf children, it meant that these deaf young people went on to achieve remarkably brilliant things in Scotland. We're real pioneers in Scotland for developing other facilities and other provisions. And we should be very proud of that, not take it for granted and build on it. But the message that came through is that education is critical. So it goes to the points that Tess White and Pam Gossel were making in particular, that education is the lifeline for young people, and it sets them up to be able to achieve whatever they want to achieve if you get that first intervention right, which is why I think it's so important. But on how we celebrate that heritage, I mean, there's a number of heritage. There's a number of heritage sites in Edinburgh, in particular, that showcases that history. Maybe we could work with some of them, particularly with Deaf Action, isn't it? That's in the old church in Edinburgh. Work with them to showcase. They've got wonderful exhibition showcasing of the history, wonderful pictures on the wall and so on, and maybe bringing that to a new audience could be quite special. I don't know if my colleagues have any other ideas on how we showcase and celebrate that heritage.
Yeah, I mean, the deaf people that we speak to on a regular basis are very protective and of their deaf culture and want to amplify that further. Some things they told us that works and can be built on is very much rooted in community activity. So there are a number of deaf clubs in Scotland which thrive and enable people to connect. That leads to intergenerational activity. So people develop role models through deaf clubs, which again can be pivotal support throughout their life and having role models. Also around parents of deaf children tell us about the importance of having support at a parent level, but also for their children to play together and teach each other BSL and the signs that they are picking up. And then there are key players like Deaf Action, who do their Deaf Festival, where it's very much a celebration of arts and wider culture. So all of these elements are particularly important, and the deaf community are clear that that's what they want to see and build on going forward.
Thanks, and thanks both for that. That's helpful. I think there's something. And Kevin, you talked about deaf clubs that came through very, very strongly in our informal engagement sessions, but also previously as well. That's where people understand that actually being deaf is an identity that is part of our wider culture. And I think there's something there's something that I'm not quite sure how we get at yet, but the acquisition of language is something that is so profoundly important to all of us as individuals, and the idea that BSL is not understood as a legitimate first language, and with everything that comes from that, the cultural associations and attributes that come with that, I still don't know whether we've captured that in any of the plans, national and local plans. If you know, other than yes, we will support deaf clubs. Yes, we'll do that. There's something more about celebrating the culture for deaf people as human beings with a legitimate a priori culture, if you like, that isn't mediated through translation or interpretation into English or into Gaelic or into any other language. BSL is the language, and I just wonder if there's a way of thinking about it that we could do better for. And I appreciate that's probably quite a big conversation, but if you've got anything further on that, I'd be interested.
The way to identify the answer to that question is probably to consult with the community about ideas for where they would like to see progress. On language policy, it's always fascinating that politicians generally crave targets and outcomes and outputs, and rightly so, but often that misses the wealth of heritage and the wealth of history and the wealth of community and the wealth of culture, which are harder to squeeze into obvious outcomes. That's what you see with other languages as well. And I wonder whether there's a question there to pose to the community themselves around both from the committee's perspective in terms of your recommendations and also the government's actions, what to prioritise, what actions to prioritise.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. That brings our second panel session to a close. And I must say, as a North East Doric BSL user, I appreciate the awareness of regional BSL this morning. And I'm sure my dad will be watching, so he'll be pleased about that. Thank you, Deputy First Minister, and thank you, officials, for joining us. We will now suspend briefly before discussing our third agenda item. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back. Our next agenda item is consideration of a Type 1 consent notification for the Private International Law Implementation of Agreements Act 2020, and I refer members to paper 3. The Minister for Victims and Community Safety wrote to the committee on the 27th of May to give notice of the Scottish Government's proposal to consent to the UK statutory instrument. The UK Government intends to lay the instrument on the 1st of September 2025. Do any members wish to make any comments on the Scottish Government's notification? Maggie.
Thanks very much, Convener. I don't have any objection to the Scottish Government's approach on this, but I wonder if we could say in our letter to the Scottish Government that it would be useful maybe in the conversations around this for the government to share a little bit more information. As outlined in page 6 of the annex that we've got in our papers, Scotland has experts on private international law, including in Dundee, at Dundee University in my region. And I think their expertise would be useful in consultation processes on these issues, which are probably, well, they are much more complex and nuanced post-Brexit. So it's just, how do we, can we suggest to the government that there are people out there who can actually help us understand some of these things better if they choose to engage and to go wider, which they haven't in this case, but could do in future.
Are members content to take on Maggie's suggestions and ask for more detail on this? Yep. Thank you. Are we therefore content to agree to the Scottish Government's decision to consent to the UK regulations? We're agreed. Thank you. We will write to the Scottish Government and we will take on board Maggie's suggestions. Thank you. That concludes our formal business in public this morning, and we will now move into our private session to discuss the remaining items on our agenda. Thank you.